In 1995, the city of Chicago pulsed with a hum of ambition. Towers of glass reached for the sky. The smell of gasoline and hot pretzels mixed in the streets, and the divide between wealth and poverty stretched like an invisible canyon. On a winter morning when the cold stung like needles, a man named Thomas Reid walked out of his penthouse, the crown jewel of a 48-story high-rise. He was 38, tall, broad-shouldered, with a kind of polished look that made people step aside when he entered a room. By day, he was the CEO of Reid Enterprises, a multi-million-dollar logistics empire that had quietly grown into a powerful name in the Midwest. But that wasn't the story anyone was going to remember him for. What would be remembered was a strange secret life he began to live that year when he decided to become someone else entirely. But before we dive into the full part of the story, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and also follow for more interesting stories to come. Thomas had everything: wealth, reputation, a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, even the respect of competitors who envied his instincts. Yet something gnawed at him, a hollow sensation he couldn't fill with champagne or the roar of applause at corporate galas. His company prided itself on efficiency, on moving goods faster and cheaper than anyone else, but he was haunted by the thought that he didn't really know what it meant to struggle. He had grown up comfortable, climbed higher with ruthless skill, and now found himself detached from the very people his business touched. That January, on a night when snow fell thick enough to muffle even the busiest intersections, Thomas took off his tailored suit, set aside his Rolex, and dressed in clothes he had pulled from a charity bin he had secretly donated 2 weeks earlier. A torn flannel shirt, boots with the soles nearly gone, and a jacket that smelled faintly of mildew. He stuffed a wool cap over his dark hair, dirted his face with ash from his fireplace, and left through the service elevator no one ever saw him use. On the street, the world didn't see a CEO. They saw another homeless man. It was intoxicating. At first, he only wandered for hours, observing. He slipped beneath the L tracks where others huddled near trash can fires, listened to them swap stories of eviction notices and lost jobs, and he realized how invisible he was now. No one looked at him with expectation. No one demanded. They dismissed him with a glance, the way most city dwellers dismiss the forgotten. He wasn't Thomas Reid here. He was just another man on the bottom rung of the city's ladder. The first time he accepted change from a stranger, his heart hammered in his chest. A woman in a wool coat, rushing to catch the train, dropped a few coins into his paper cup without meeting his eyes. Thomas stared at the quarters, his mind torn between guilt and exhilaration. He began to spend nights outside. Not every night. At first, he would slip back to his penthouse, shower, shave, and return to his office by 8 a.m. sharp, wearing Italian suits no one questioned. But more and more, the city streets drew him in. He wanted to feel the bite of coal that sank into bone, to understand hunger when he skipped meals, to walk among the men and women society avoided. There was Marcus, a Vietnam veteran who told him stories of jungles and ambushes. There was Clarissa, a woman whose laugh rang through the alleys even though her fingers were blue from frostbite. There was an old man named Harold who taught him how to find places to sleep where police wouldn't chase him away. They never asked for his real name. They only knew him as Tommy. The double life began to consume him. By day, he commanded conference rooms, negotiated deals worth millions, and signed contracts that expanded his empire. By night, he sat on cold sidewalks with a cardboard sign, eyes lowered, asking strangers for coins he didn't need. And then something unexpected happened. He stopped looking at his company the same way. At a board meeting in March, when his executives discussed cutting costs by reducing wages for warehouse workers, Thomas found himself slamming his hand on the table. "No," he said, startling the room into silence. You cut the men and women who keep this machine alive. Find another way." The board exchanged glances. Thomas had never spoken like that before. He had always been pragmatic, profit first. Now there was fire in his eyes, the kind of fire only someone who had shared a blanket with a freezing could carry. The rumors started soon after. Employees whispered that Mr. Reid had changed. Some said he spent nights driving around warehouses. Others swore they had seen him at odd hours near soup kitchens, but none could prove it. In truth, he was walking a dangerous line. In April of 1995, something happened that nearly broke his secret wide open. Thomas had been staying beneath an overpass with Marcus and Clarissa when a fight broke out between two men over a bottle of cheap whiskey. One pulled a knife. Thomas tried to break it up, but in the chaos, the blade slashed across his palm. Blood spilled onto the frozen pavement. Police arrived minutes later, sirens blaring, and everyone scattered. Thomas, clutching his hand, ran into the shadows. The next morning, he walked into Reid Enterprises with his hand bandaged. His assistant, Margaret, frowned immediately. "What happened?" "Cut myself opening a bottle," Thomas said smoothly, forcing a smile. But Margaret didn't look convinced. The lie lodged like a thorn in his chest. He had lied 1,000 times in business deals, but never about something like this. It was different when the lie protected a secret self, one that had become strangely precious to him. Weeks passed. The scar on his palm healed, but the pull toward the streets only grew stronger. He started using money from his own pocket to quietly fund shelters and soup kitchens, but never in his name. He wanted no recognition. He wanted the experience. One night, as he sat by a fire with Marcus, the veteran looked at him with narrowed eyes. "You ain't like the rest of us. Tommy, your hands are too clean. Your words, different. Who are you really?" Thomas froze. For the first time, someone had seen through the disguise. His mind raced. To confess would be madness, but to deny too strongly would raise suspicion. So he only shrugged and said, "Does it matter?" Marcus studied him a long time, then nodded slowly. "Guess not. As long as you're here, you're one of us." It should have eased Thomas. Instead, it bound him tighter to the lie he was building. By summer, he was living two full lives, two men in one body. One a CEO whose signature shifted markets. The other a shadow man on the streets, forgotten, invisible. And he knew that eventually, the two worlds would collide. Because secrets never stayed buried in Chicago. By the end of summer 1995, Thomas Reid was balancing on a razor's edge. His company, Reid Enterprises, was reaching heights no competitor could touch. Investors lauded him as a visionary. Magazines requested interviews. His face appeared in glossy spreads with headlines like "The Relentless Rise of Thomas Reid." Yet while the public painted him as an untouchable titan, his nights told a different story. He sat on cracked sidewalk beneath flickering streetlights, trading half-burnt cigarettes with Marcus and Clarissa. He watched rats scurry through alleys as they split cups of watery soup from church volunteers. It was as if he were two men stitched into one skin, and every passing week made the seam weaker. One humid August night, the collision began. He had spent the day in his penthouse, preparing for an important meeting with international partners. The kind of deal that could expand his empire beyond the Midwest. The kind of deal his board salivated over. But when the meeting ended, when handshakes and champagne were exchanged, Thomas excused himself, claiming exhaustion. Instead of going home, he slipped into his tattered Tommy clothes, pulling the wool cap low over his forehead. The city was restless that night. The air buzzed with tension, as though something ugly waited just around the corner. He found Marcus and Clarissa under the L tracks, exactly where they always were. But they weren't alone. A young man, jittery and thin, paced back and forth, muttering to himself. His eyes burned with desperation. Thomas had seen men like him before, addiction hollowing them out until nothing was left but hunger for their next fix. "Who's the new guy?" Thomas whispered to Marcus. "Name's Kenny," Marcus replied, his voice low. "Been around a few weeks. Trouble follows him." Trouble arrived quicker than Thomas expected. Kenny pulled a knife from his coat, eyes darting. "Empty your pockets," he hissed, voice trembling. Clarissa froze. Marcus raised his hands. Thomas's instinct, honed from years of commanding boardrooms, was to take control. He stepped forward, put the knife down. "Kenny, you don't want to do this." But Kenny wasn't listening. His hand shook, the blade flashing in the dim light. I said empty your pockets. And then, before Thomas could stop him, police lights washed the alley in red and blue. "Chicago PD," an officer shouted. "Drop the weapon." Kenny panicked. He bolted. Clarissa screamed. Marcus pressed himself against the wall. And Thomas, still in his homeless disguise, found himself tackled to the ground by an officer who hadn't seen the difference. "Got another one." The cop backed, and he pressed into Thomas's back. His cheeks scraped against the filthy pavement. For a surreal moment, Thomas forgot who he was. He wasn't a CEO. He wasn't powerful. He was just another man in dirty clothes, mistaken for a criminal. "Wait!" Thomas gasped. "You don't understand." But his words were drowned by the crackle of radios and the chaos of Kenny's arrest. At the precinct, the officers booked him as John Doe. They didn't believe his protests. To them, he was just another liar from the streets. They fingerprinted him, photographed him, and locked him in a holding cell with 3 other men who smelled of sweat and hopelessness. Hours passed. His boardroom confidence drained away. He sat on the hard bench, staring at the bars, realizing for the first time how thin the line was between his 2 worlds. Morning came, and with it, the disaster he feared. The door clanged open. An officer called his name, his real one, Thomas Reid. Every head in the cell snapped toward him. Whispers rose like a tide. Thomas Reid, the businessman, the millionaire. He stood slowly, his disguise in tatters, both literal and figurative. A man in a tailored suit strode into the room. His lawyer, Alan Mercer, face flushed with fury. "What the hell have you done, Thomas?" Within the hour, Thomas was released. The officers, suddenly pale, apologized profusely once the mistake was clear. But the damage was done. Reporters had already caught wind that the CEO of Reid Enterprises had been arrested in a homeless encampment. By evening, it was front-page news. Billionaire CEO found among homeless during police raid. The board demanded answers. Shareholders panicked. And Margaret, his loyal assistant, cornered him in his office. "Thomas," she said quietly, her eyes searching his. "Tell me the truth. Why were you there?" For a long time, he said nothing. The lie trembled on his tongue. But something in Margaret's gaze, steady, unflinching, broke him. He exhaled, leaning against the mahogany desk that had always symbolized his control. "Because I needed to know," he whispered. "I needed to see what it was really like out there. The people who live in the cracks of this city, they're invisible to us, Margaret. To me, I couldn't stand the thought that I was building an empire without understanding the ground it stood on." Margaret's expression softened, though fear lingered in her eyes. "You've built more than an empire, Thomas. You've built a reputation. If this gets worse, everything you've worked for could collapse." He knew she was right. But even as the walls of his carefully constructed life shook, Thomas couldn't bring himself to regret it. The streets had changed him in ways no boardroom ever could. Still, the scandal spread. Clients questioned his stability. Rivals mocked him. The public, divided, painted him as either a hero trying to understand poverty or a lunatic playing dress-up with people suffering. Marcus and Clarissa, meanwhile, vanished. When Thomas tried to return to the underpass, they were gone. The fire barrel was cold, their belongings scattered as though they'd been chased away. For the first time, he felt the full weight of both lives closing in. If he went back to the streets, he risked losing everything he had built. If he stayed in the tower, he risked losing himself. In late September, Reid Enterprises hosted its annual charity gala, a glittering event where tuxedos sparkled and glasses clinked beneath chandeliers. Thomas stood at the podium, cameras flashing, and looked out over the sea of wealthy faces. He had a choice to make: pretend nothing had happened, or admit the truth, fully and without disguise. The microphone hummed softly. His hands trembled, though no one noticed. "My name is Thomas Reid," he began, voice steady. "And for the last 8 months, I've been living a double life." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. "I have walked the streets of this city disguised as a homeless man. I have sat with them eaten with them, and suffered the cold beside them. I did this not out of madness, but out of need. I needed to understand the people we ignore every day, the ones who remind us that humanity is not built on profit, but on compassion. The room was silent. Even the clinking glasses stopped. Thomas took a breath, feeling the weight of his confession. I know some of you will call me reckless. Some will call me a fool. Perhaps you're right. But I will not apologize for seeking truth in places we would rather not look. When he stepped away from the podium, applause did not come immediately. The silence stretched, sharp as glass. And then, softly, from the back, one pair of hands began to clap. It grew, slowly, until the room was a storm of applause. Not everyone joined, but enough did to shake the chandeliers. Thomas smiled faintly, though he knew the applause was only the beginning. The real consequences were yet to come, because Chicago had just heard his confession, and the city never forgot. The applause from the gala followed Thomas Reid into the headlines once again. Only this time, it wasn't rumor or speculation. It was his own words, his own admission. Newspapers printed his face across their covers. CEO admits of living as homeless. Some praise his honesty, calling it bold, visionary, even humanitarian. Others labeled him reckless, unstable, and unfit to lead a corporation worth billions. The split was brutal. Overnight, he went from titan to controversy. By October 1995, the boardroom was a battlefield. "You humiliated this company," one executive barked, slamming a folder onto the polished table. "Our investors are pulling out. Do you have any idea how much stock we've lost in a week?" Thomas sat at the head of the table, calm but weary. He hadn't slept properly in days. "I told the truth," he replied evenly. "If investors can't handle honesty, perhaps they're in the wrong business." "This isn't about honesty," another snapped. "It's about perception. You made us look unstable. People think our CEO has lost his mind." The room buzzed with outrage, but Margaret, seated quietly beside him, lifted her chin. "Or perhaps," she said, her voice sharp, "people think our CEO has more courage than the rest of you combined." The room fell into tense silence. No one dared challenge Margaret directly. She had been Thomas's right hand for a decade, and her loyalty was legendary. Still, Thomas knew the truth. His empire was slipping. The company could withstand bad press for a while, but investors had short patience. If he didn't steady the ship soon, he would lose everything. Yet as the corporate world tightened its grip on him, the streets whispered to him louder than ever. He couldn't stop thinking about Marcus and Clarissa. After the police raid, they had vanished like smoke. Thomas returned again and again to their old spots under bridges and alleys, but he found nothing. Their absence gnawed at him, a reminder that while he wrestled with reputations, real lives were swallowed by the city's shadows. One night in late October, he finally got a lead. A volunteer at a soup kitchen recognized his description of Clarissa. "She was here last week," the woman said. "She looked bad, real bad. I think she's in the hospital now." Thomas didn't hesitate. He drove across the city, abandoning the leather seats of his Bentley for the fluorescent lights of a public hospital. There, in a cramped ward crowded with the forgotten, he found her. Clarissa lay on a thin mattress, her laughter gone, her body weak from pneumonia. Her eyes fluttered open when he entered, and for a moment, confusion clouded her face. "Tommy," she rasped. He sat beside her, taking her hand. "It's me." Tears welled in her eyes. "Where have you been?" "Marcus, they took him away. Said he got into a fight. I don't know where." Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "I'll find him," he promised. Clarissa squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. "Don't forget us, Tommy. Don't go back to being dumb." Her words pierced him deeper than any boardroom insult. He stayed with her until dawn, watching her chest rise and fall, fragile but alive. The next day, back in his office, Thomas stared at the skyline from his glass tower. The city looked different now, less like an empire, more like a battlefield between light and shadow. He knew what he had to do. At the next board meeting, he walked in with a proposal that stunned everyone. "We're establishing a new division of Reid Enterprises," he declared. "One dedicated to housing initiatives, job training, and reintegration for the homeless population of Chicago. We will fund shelters. We will create opportunities. And we will not do it quietly." The executives erupted. "Are you insane? That's not our business model." "It is now," Thomas said firmly. His voice carried the weight of a man who had sat in the dirt and felt the cold creep into his bones. "If this company cannot adapt to serve the people who keep this city alive, then I don't want this company at all." The board threatened revolt. Some resigned. Stock dipped further. But others, investors who believed in the long game, leaders who saw the changing winds of public opinion, leaned in with cautious interest. And as winter crept back into Chicago, something extraordinary happened. Word spread through the city's underpasses, shelters, and soup kitchens. Reid Enterprises was funding a new program, one that wasn't just writing checks to charity, but creating real opportunities. Training centers opened in old warehouses. Transitional housing projects broke ground. Jobs were offered to those who had none. And slowly, Thomas began to see Marcus again, not under the tracks, but standing in line for a training session, his posture straighter, his eyes clearer. Clarissa, too, recovered in the hospital and later joined one of the first housing units. The city's perception began to shift. The scandal of the CEO who pretended to be homeless transformed into the story of the CEO who acted on what he saw. By the spring of 1996, Thomas Reid had become a symbol, not of wealth, not of disgrace, but of possibility. He was still controversial, still polarizing, but no one could deny the results. Thousands of lives touched, a company transformed. But beneath the triumph, Thomas knew the truth. He had not saved the city. He had only begun. Poverty was not an illness cured by one man's conscience. It was a wound that required constant tending. Still, when he walked through the streets now, he was no longer in disguise. People recognized him. Some cursed him, others thanked him, but all of them saw him. And that, he realized, was what mattered most: to be seen, to no longer be invisible. On a quiet evening, months after his confession, Thomas returned to the underpass where it had all begun. The barrel fire was gone, the shadows thinner, but he could still hear the echoes of laughter, of whispered stories shared in the dark. He placed his hand, the one still scarred from the knife wound, against a cold concrete pillar. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I didn't forget you." For Thomas Reid, the man who had once worn two lives, the disguise was gone. What remained was something truer, something stronger, a man who had chosen to carry both worlds within him, no matter the cost. And in that choice, he found what he had been missing all along. Not power, not profit, but purpose.